January 1946, a wind like broken glass swept through the ruins near Lübeck. The war was over, but the cold had not surrendered. Amid the white silence, a British private loosened the buttons of his khaki greatcoat and stepped toward a woman who once wore the enemy's badge. She was shivering, barefoot, her Red Cross armband half torn, eyes hollow like cellars after the bombing. He didn't shout orders. He whispered, "Take my coat, madame." No soundtrack. Just the rasp of fabric, the crunch of boots, and the stunned breath of a dozen soldiers watching mercy cross a line no bullet had ever dared. They had been told, never trust them, never pity them. But that morning, frost bit deeper than hate. The private, Thomas Ellis, age 20, 4 from Leeds, had lost 3 brothers in the Blitz. Still, his fingers unbuttoned the coat anyway. And somewhere inside the barbed wire, the myth of enemies began to melt. The German woman, a former nurse named Annelies, couldn't speak. She only bowed her head, pressing the wool to her face like a confession. The guards froze, no one moved, because kindness, in that moment, felt more dangerous than any gun. If you're watching this right now, pause for a second. Tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from, and what time is it there? Because history doesn't just live in books. It lives in the small decisions people make when no one expects grace. The field report dated January 10th described the scene in 7 dry words. 1 coat issued to female internee for warmth. But it never mentioned the silence that followed, or the tears that fell into the snow, vanishing before anyone dared wipe them away. That single gesture would echo through the camp. A rumor, a rebellion, a question whispered among uniforms. What does victory mean if we forget how to be human? Thomas turned away before she could thank him. Steam rose from his breath, the same color as hers. And as the morning sun fractured across the frost, both sides felt something new, the unbearable weight of kindness. January 1946, inside a converted barracks near Lübeck, the war's noise had gone silent. Only boots on wooden floors and the distant rattle of tin cups. The prisoners here weren't soldiers anymore, they were German women, stripped of rank, identity, and warmth. Mothers, nurses, radio operators. Many had worn Luftwaffe patches months ago. Now they stitched bandages for each other in cold daylight. British reports called them female internees, not enemies, but behind the paperwork, the reality breathed frost. 1 in 10 POW camps now held women, about 30,000 scattered across northern Germany. Most were too thin to stand during roll call. Their fingers trembled not from guilt, but from hunger. Corporal Hughes, age 23, watched them from a guard post. He'd expected arrogance. Instead, he saw hollow eyes staring at the ground. They looked like ghosts, he murmured. The sergeant beside him only grunted. Ghosts don't cry. But they did cry, quietly, into the sleeves of coats that weren't theirs. One afternoon during ration hour, a British cook handed out thin soup, 800 calories a day, barley and boiled carrot. A woman with frostbitten hands whispered, "Dank." He nodded, pretending not to understand, but her gratitude hit harder than any German shell he'd ever ducked. That night, a rumor spread among guards. The English were giving blankets. No one ordered it. No officer approved. It just happened, one small act at a time. A shared cigarette, a hot kettle left accidentally near the women's quarters. Humanity growing in the cracks of command. A captured nurse later recalled, "They didn't look at us like victors. They looked like men tired of hating." The war had ended on paper, but inside these fences, people were still figuring out how to stop fighting. By dawn, snow had softened the camp's edges. British boots and German clogs left the same muddy prints. And when the bell rang for morning duty, someone noticed a wild thing. laughter, faint and nervous, from the women's barracks. It startled the guards. It sounded like peace trying to breathe. February 1946. Dawn leaked through the cracks of a field kitchen roof. Tin mugs clanged, kettles hissed, and the smell of burnt barley drifted through the camp. The British Army Service Corps was serving breakfast, bread, margarine, and watery soup. Barely 800 calories per person, yet that morning something unusual happened. Private Lewis, a 19-year-old driver from Manchester, poured hot tea into an extra mug. He hesitated, glancing toward the women standing behind the fence. Nurses, clerks, widows, all shivering under thin blankets. Then he walked over, pushed the cup through the gap, and said softly, "Careful, it's hot." The German woman froze. For a second she looked at him like he was mocking her. Then she took it, both hands shaking, steam fogging her face. The entire line went still. No one spoke. The British sergeant nearby pretended not to see, maybe because he understood. Later, the men joked in whispers, "We've gone mad." One said. Lewis only replied, "Maybe we finally got sane." Reports from the Royal Army Archives confirm moments like this were real. Small, unrecorded exchanges where the war quietly unraveled inside people's hearts. Soldiers who'd lost friends in Normandy now shared tea with the wives of their enemies. One observer wrote, "We'd been told the Germans had no tears. That was wrong." Across the wire, women tried to smile. Some offered pieces of hand, stitched lace as thanks. Others simply nodded, too proud or too broken to speak. And in that fragile silence, history took a breath because compassion, once spoken aloud, couldn't be unsaid. For the first time, British and German hands touched not through violence, but through a dented tin cup. That sound, the quiet clink of metal, echoed louder than artillery ever had. The guards returned to their duties, pretending it hadn't happened. But the frost on the barbed wire had begun to melt, drop by drop. The field kitchen that once fed prisoners now fed something else, forgiveness. The camera would freeze here, steam curling upward, faces half, lit by sunrise, uniforms fading into the same color of humanity. March 1946, the snow was thinning at Lüneburg Heath, where once the German surrender had been signed. The air still smelled of diesel and damp canvas, but the thunder of war had faded into a strange calm. British soldiers walked the perimeter, their rifles slung low, watching over the same people they had once sworn to destroy. Inside the camp, a young woman named Greta knelt near the fence, mending a torn glove. The wool was British. She knew from the smell of soap and smoke. She'd been given it by a corporal weeks ago. This morning, she had stitched something into the lining, a tiny thread in red, forming one word, dank. Corporal Thomas Ellis, yes, the same one who'd once offered his coat, found the glove hanging on the fence post when he passed by. The sight froze him mid-step. He looked around, half expecting reprimand, half hoping no one saw. He turned the glove in his hands, tracing the stitched letters, and whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." There were 420, 5,000 POW across 700 British run camps now, for the guards routine had replaced fear. But small, silent exchanges like this one made the routine feel human. One sergeant wrote in his diary, "They do not curse anymore. They garden, they sing, and sometimes they thank us." Another added, "It makes me feel guilty to see them smile." Because that was the hidden war now. Guilt versus grace. The British men had come to command, not to comfort. Yet the more they saw hunger and humility, the harder it became to hate. When Ellis returned to his hut that night, he placed the glove beside his bedroll. He couldn't stop staring at the red thread glowing faintly in the lamplight. That one word, dank, carried more weight than any medal he'd ever imagined. Outside, snow began to fall again, thin as ash. The camp slept. The war, it seemed, was still teaching lessons that no general had planned. April 1946. Back in the barracks of Kent, the postroom smelled of ink, damp wool, and cheap tobacco. British soldiers lined up to write letters home, not to boast, but to breathe. Paper had become their confessional. Private Thomas Ellis sat at a wooden desk, staring at the blank sheet. His fingers hesitated like a man afraid of his own truth. Then he wrote, "Mum, they're not what we were told. They cry for their children, same as ours." Across the camps, 14,000 British men were still stationed for POW management. The job was supposed to be procedural, counts, reports, deliveries, but every day blurred the line between duty and decency. One letter, intercepted by the censors, read, "I gave my coat away, and she smiled. It felt wrong, but right." Another soldier confessed, "We used to hate the sound of their language. Now it sounds like sorrow." These weren't the words of conquerors. They were fragments of men unlearning hate. The war had trained them to pull triggers, not to shake hands. But now, shaking hands was harder. In local pubs back home, people spoke of vengeance. Newspapers still printed headlines about Nazi trials, reparations, rebuilding. Yet in the quiet corners of the British postal network, a different story traveled, one of ordinary men discovering empathy after apocalypse. Historian reports later estimated that by spring 1946, more than 60% of POW guards admitted feeling sympathy or respect for their captives. It wasn't treason, it was transformation. A corporal's wife in Birmingham replied to her husband's letter with 4 simple words, "Be kind, come home." He folded that note into his pocket, beside his rations card, a reminder that humanity could survive even when everything else had burned. That night, Thomas sealed his letter and looked around at the barracks, laughter, radio static, snoring men. He realized something haunting. They had all changed without noticing. The uniform had stayed the same. The heart inside it hadn't. He whispered, "Mum would understand," and blew the lamp out. May 1946, the snow finally gave up. Mud turned to soil, and something unexpected began to bloom inside the camps. Where barbed wire ended, tiny green shoots broke through the frost, tulips, daffodils, small vegetables planted by hands once trained for war. It started with one German woman, a nurse named Anneliese, the same woman who'd been given Thomas Ellis's coat months earlier. She found a patch of dirt near the watchtower, dug with a tin spoon, and dropped 2 seeds she'd hidden in her pocket since evacuation. A British officer saw her. Instead of shouting, he watched. The next day, he brought her a shovel. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. These were prisoners of a war that had scorched half of Europe, now rebuilding beauty in a patch of foreign earth. By June, the women had created a narrow garden strip outside their barracks, 5 meters long, filled with tulips bending in the wind. Field notes from the Royal Engineers record the scene. Unauthorized cultivation tolerated, improves morale for both parties. In plain English, it meant, let them plant. It keeps hope alive. A captured typist later said when the first flower opened, a British officer smiled. He said nothing, but we knew he understood. That smile traveled faster than any command. Soon, the soldiers began helping quietly, a bucket of water here, a handful of seeds there. They even set up a small wooden sign at the edge of the garden that read simply, "No trampling." The camp that once smelled of rust and sweat now carried the faint perfume of wet soil and blooming petals. And in that fragile scent was proof. Peace was not declared, it was grown. A guard named Hughes wrote in his diary, "I think the flowers forgive us faster than people do." That line never made it into official reports, but it survived in his family's scrapbook for decades. As sunlight fell on the tulips, British and German eyes met across the fence again, not in suspicion, but in silent understanding. June 1946, rain tapped against the tin roof of the officers' mess in Yorkshire. Inside, cigarette smoke curled like battle fog over a table of British sergeants. Their uniforms were pressed, their voices sharp. But beneath the laughter ran an unease. The war outside had ended, yet another had begun within. Sergeant Miller slammed his cup down. "They don't deserve pity," he said, eyes hard. "They burned cities, they buried children. Don't start giving them flowers." No one answered. Across from him, Corporal Hughes stared into his tea, remembering the German women planting tulips behind the wire. "Maybe," he said quietly, "they're trying to bury something else." The room went still. Kindness was not part of the manual. Orders were clear: guard, feed, control. But the heart has no rank structure. Post-war Britain was split in half. 62% of the public, according to a Manchester Gazette survey, opposed leniency toward German prisoners. Letters to Parliament demanded punishment, not mercy. Yet inside the camps, British soldiers found themselves fighting a different kind of battle, between revenge and redemption. Captain Rowland, the camp's commanding officer, tried to draw a line. "Gentlemen," he said during briefing, "compassion is not surrender. Discipline must coexist with decency." But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice when he added, "Still, don't forget what they did." That tension hung heavy in every meal, every patrol. A smile, exchanged through the fence, could trigger suspicion. A shared cigarette could ruin a career. Yet the men kept doing it. Small rebellions of empathy, waged quietly against orders. Hughes later wrote, "Kindness is a soldier's rebellion. When everything teaches you to hate, mercy feels like mutiny." Outside, the rain stopped. A faint rainbow arched over the camp, colors blurring into gray sky. The tulips shimmered below it, soaked but unbroken. A few guards paused to look. None spoke, all thinking the same thing. Perhaps peace begins when soldiers stop obeying hate. That night, as the barracks lights dimmed, a rumor began to spread, something that would shake the command structure again, not with violence, but with emotion. July 1946, rumors began to move faster than the mail trucks. In nearly every British-run POW camp across Germany, whispers floated between bunks and watchtowers that some soldiers were exchanging letters with German women prisoners. The military called it fraternization. The men called it conversation. At first, it was harmless: a folded paper hidden inside a bread loaf, a note slipped under a tin cup. Then came the small tokens: pressed flowers, hand, sewn patches, a sketch of a face drawn on scrap cardboard. By summer's end, over 1,000 documented cases had been quietly logged by intelligence officers. Private Lewis, the same boy who had shared tea through the wire, now found himself writing poems to a woman named Greta, the one who stitched dank into a glove. His words weren't romantic. They were confessions. "I don't know if I forgive you," he wrote, "but I can't forget you." When a military censor intercepted one of the letters, he wrote in red ink across the page, "Prohibited contact," but it was too late. The emotional front had already been breached. Major Sinclair, the intelligence officer overseeing discipline, muttered to his aide, "This is how empires fall, not by guns, but by empathy." He wasn't entirely wrong. The line between enemy and human was dissolving faster than the ink on confiscated envelopes. To many in command, it felt like betrayal. To those who'd lived through shellfire, it felt like healing. A German woman's diary, recovered years later, contained a single entry. He wrote that he hated my uniform, not me. I think that is how peace begins. The guards began to look different after that, standing a little longer at the fences, checking for replies, smiling when none should. The higher officers tried to stop it, but emotion has no chain of command. In one camp, a reprimand notice circulated that read, "The heart is not a weapon to be issued." Someone penciled beneath it, "But it can disarm one." The British soldiers didn't stop writing. They just hid their words better. December 1946, the wind came back like an old memory. It swept across the repatriation station near Bremen, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke, wet wool, and uncertainty. The German prisoners were finally going home, 700,000 of them. But home was now a word written on ruins. Among the line of women waiting for transport stood Anneliese. She still wore the same British coat, its fabric rough, its seams frayed, its buttons mismatched from repairs done with hospital thread. In its pocket she kept a folded ration card and a letter she never sent. A British sergeant approached, clipboard in hand. "Name, Anneliese Weber," she replied, her voice almost steady. He checked the list, nodded, and paused when he saw the coat. "That's not regulation issue," he said quietly. She smiled the kind that hides tears. "A soldier gave it to me," she whispered. He said, "Take my coat, madame." For a moment the sergeant forgot to breathe. Everyone had heard that story, a coat, a gesture, a rumor of compassion. Nobody knew who the soldier was anymore, but the act had outlived his name. As Anneliese boarded the truck, snow began to fall again, thin, patient, and forgiving. A British officer watching from the platform wrote later in his diary, "They left in silence, but the silence was no longer shame. It was gratitude." In the records of the repatriation office, one small note survived: "Female POW transported with British uniform item retained for warmth." Just another line in a stack of papers. But between those lines lived a heartbeat, a reminder that mercy, once given, refuses to die. When the convoy rolled away, Anneliese looked back at the camp's fading outline. The coat weighed heavy on her shoulders, not from fabric, but from memory. She whispered to herself, "England has more," and the truck disappeared into the snowstorm. The story of that coat, and the man who gave it, would travel farther than any uniformed report. It would cross oceans, enter newspapers, and eventually become a symbol of the war's quiet redemption. January 1947, London had started breathing again. Bombed-out streets were filling with market stalls, laughter, and ration queues. The war was now a headline, not a heartbeat. Yet, tucked between reports of rebuilding and royal visits, something strange began to appear in the papers, stories of kindness. The Manchester Gazette ran a small column titled "Quiet Acts of Decency." It told of British soldiers who shared rations, repaired broken shoes, and, in one unforgettable case, gave their coats to German prisoners. The article named no one, but readers knew the story. The words, "Take my coat, madame," became a whisper of pride, a paradox of victory softened by grace. Back in Kent, Thomas Ellis read that clipping during his morning tea. The black ink trembled in his hands. For a moment he thought maybe someone remembered. He folded the paper carefully, as if it were sacred, and slipped it inside his Bible. The Ministry of Defense didn't comment, of course. Officially, compassion wasn't policy, it was individual discretion, but quietly, public opinion began to shift. For the first time since 1945, people spoke about Germans not as monsters, but as humans. Letters poured into local editors. They made us proud in defeat, not victory. Historians later noted that this small wave of stories did more for reconciliation than any treaty. They didn't glorify war, they redeemed humanity. In one café, A retired officer was overheard telling his wife, "We taught the world how to fight. Maybe it's time we teach it how to forgive." She nodded, stirring her tea. "Forgiveness always tastes like courage," she said. By spring, more articles followed, women who returned the borrowed coats by post, sometimes decades later. Photographs appeared of POW gardens, now blooming freely in German villages. The cycle had turned. The seeds, planted behind wire, were now growing across borders. And though Thomas never sought recognition, he couldn't escape the ripple his small act had caused. Each time someone said, "Take my coat," in jest or kindness, he felt the echo of that freezing morning all over again. He smiled once, quietly, and said to a friend, "Maybe peace isn't signed on paper. Maybe it's handed one coat at a time." September 1950, Munich was quiet under a thin autumn sun. Trams rattled past burned-out shells of buildings that had finally been rebuilt. Inside a small apartment, Anneliese opened a worn suitcase. Beneath folded linen and faded papers lay something she hadn't touched in years, the British coat. Its wool was brittle now, its lining patched with care. But when she lifted it to her face, the smell of old soap and tobacco returned like a ghost. She remembered the man's voice, steady, unsure, kind. "Take my coat, madame." She sat at her desk and began to write. "To whoever finds this letter, I still have the coat. I kept it not for warmth, but for memory. It reminded me that kindness can survive orders, uniforms, and even shame." In the years after the war, the Red Cross had gathered hundreds of testimonies from women POW. Most were stories of loss, hunger, or silence. But a few, like hers, spoke of small mercies that felt like miracles. One archivist later described them as footnotes of humanity in a century of madness. Anneliese's letter joined those archives in 1953. It was never published, but historians would quote one line decades later in documentaries and museum walls. It smelled of forgiveness. Outside, Munich's new city center buzzed with life, children playing, music drifting from cafes. Peace had finally become ordinary. Yet in that tiny apartment, the past was still folded neatly in a coat. She placed it back into the suitcase, closed the latch, and wrote one last sentence on the envelope. "If England ever wants it returned, tell them it was never truly theirs to begin with. It belongs to mercy." That same winter in a post office in Leeds, Thomas Ellis, older now, slower, sorted letters without knowing that one of them, somewhere across the sea, carried his echo. History had forgotten their names, but not their gesture. And in a world rebuilding its walls, one story quietly reminded everyone that warmth can outlive war. April 1961, a quiet street in Leeds hummed with the rhythm of post, or normalcy, milk bottles clinking, bicycles squeaking, and the morning paper landing on porches. Among the uniformed postmen moving through drizzle was one whose limp made him slower, Thomas Ellis, age 39. The man who had once said, "Take my coat, madame." No one in the neighborhood knew much about him. He never mentioned the war, not even on Remembrance Day. While others at the pub traded stories of battlefields and medals, Thomas simply smiled, nodding politely. When asked what he'd done during the war, he would reply, "Delivered things then too, only heavier." He lived alone in a modest flat above a tailor's shop. Every morning, before leaving for work, he opened a wooden drawer where a single photograph lay. A group of soldiers standing in snow, their faces blurred, one coat missing. Sometimes he'd trace the edges of the picture, as if confirming that the memory was real. Studies later showed that 60% of British veterans who served as POW guards never spoke about it, not from shame, but from something quieter, moral exhaustion. They had seen too much contradiction, too much kindness from the so-called enemy. Thomas once told his colleague, "We fought monsters, but we met humans." The man didn't understand. He just laughed and said, "You always talk strange, Ellis." Every envelope Thomas carried seemed to weigh more than paper. He delivered wedding invites, condolence letters, and government bills, small fragments of other people's lives, while keeping his own sealed shut. One rainy evening, he came home soaked, hung his post-bag on the chair, and sat in silence. The radio played faint jazz. His fingers tapped against the table, a rhythm he couldn't name. For a second, he thought of writing to Germany, but then stopped. What would he say? I still remember the snow. Instead, he whispered to the empty room, "I hope she kept it." He never knew that somewhere in Munich, a suitcase still held that coat, preserved like a monument made of cloth. October 1970. 1. An auction house in Munich catalogued the belongings of a recently deceased woman. Among the silverware, photo albums, and lace handkerchiefs sat a small brown suitcase marked simply, England, 1946. When they opened it, they found an old military coat, British issue, wool frayed at the cuffs, one button replaced with a piece of bone. In the pocket, a folded letter, yellowed and trembling at the edges. The letter read, "To whoever remembers I was not saved by victory, but by kindness. Tell them the man who gave me this coat changed what I thought an enemy could be." It was signed only Annelies. A reporter covering the auction wrote about it for a small column in The Guardian, calling it the coat of forgiveness. The story spread. Veterans recognized the tale immediately, the whispered legend of a soldier who had given warmth to a woman in the snow. Letters began arriving from across Britain. I remember hearing that story from my father. My grandfather said he saw it happen. Some even claimed to know the man's name, Thomas Ellis. But by then, Thomas was gone. He had passed quietly that same year, his post-bag still hanging in the hallway. Neighbors said he was kind, punctual, and carried an odd calm, like someone who had already made peace with the world. When a historian later matched Annelies's letter with camp archives, it confirmed the impossible symmetry. Two lives once divided by war, now reunited by memory. And so, in a century built on battles, one simple act, a coat given in silence, outlived every victory parade and every speech. In the end, the story found its way into museums, books, classrooms. Yet the message stayed the same, whispered like prayer. Humanity is not won by flags, but by gestures. The camera would fade here to the image of that coat folded neatly in glass, under museum light. Its shadow soft, its meaning endless. Sometimes the hardest prison is the one waiting at home. The kind made of memory, silence, and the things we never say aloud.